So now let's talk a little bit about color and white balance. As you've probably noticed, I'm looking a little blue right now. I certainly don't have realistic skin tones, and that's because we're lighting me right now with a fluorescent light. Fluorescent lights tend to be a little bit cooler than a standard light bulb, and we haven't yet chosen the correct white balance with our cameras to counteract that bluish tint. So now I'm going to ask David to change the white balance, and you're going to see the entire scene warm up, and all of a sudden my skin tones are going to look a lot more natural. So right now I'm looking pretty good, but what happens if we change our light source? Right here I have a fluorescent light, but over here I have an incandescent bulb. As you can see now, I am extremely red. And we're going to have to change the white balance again so that my skin tones look natural and that the correct colors are shown in this scene. So that's two quick and very simple examples of how light sources can completely change the color of light that's hitting your subject. But think about the sun and think about outside lighting. In the morning, sunlight might be very, very red, especially if it's hitting your subject directly. If the sun goes behind a cloud, it's going to get much cooler, much bluer in tint. If you go in shade, it's also going to get much cooler. And once the sun goes down behind the horizon, it's much cooler than it would normally be if the sun was directly hitting your subject. So throughout the day, photographers have to keep in mind what their colors actually look like in their pictures and set each of these color settings manually so that they are in control of what their pictures look like. So far in this tutorial, we've only been using auto white balance and the camera has been choosing the colors for us. But now I want to show you what you can do to control your color and your camera's white balance manually. Now, in most cases, auto white balance does do a really good job, but the problem doesn't necessarily lie in getting the white balance perfect. Sometimes as the photographer, we may not want a perfect white balance. We want to give it a warm or a cool tint to completely change the mood of the shot. By giving the camera control over the white balance, you're basically giving up your creative right to make that decision yourself. So I'm going to challenge you guys to start using manual white balance settings so that you are in control of the color and the mood of your pictures. So with this camera that I'm looking at right here, we're using a manual white balance, and with this camera right here, we're using an automatic white balance. And as you can see, they aren't the same. And you may argue which one is a little bit closer to absolutely perfect, but I personally prefer the look of the camera that we have manually chosen the white balance for. Now this is pretty simple to understand as long as we have one light source with one color temperature, but let's say we have a mixed color temperature. We have two different lights, one with a blue light source and one with a red light source. Imagine the camera trying to choose a correct white balance here. In situations like this, there really is no correct white balance. This side of my face is a little bit too blue and this side of my face may be a little bit too red. And if you left that up to the camera itself, it's certainly not going to be able to choose the best white balance for the situation. So in situations like these, choosing your white balance manually is even more important. So now that you have a basic understanding of how white balance works, let's head outside and I'm going to show you how in the real world you can control the color of your images. When we're talking about white balance, in many cases we're talking about a Kelvin temperature, and a Kelvin temperature works very similar to a Fahrenheit temperature or a Celsius temperature. When it comes to the camera, the higher the number, the warmer the image will look. The higher the number, the more reds will be in the image, and the lower the number, the cooler the image will look, or the more blue you will see in the exact same shot. So in most cases, cameras can range from Kelvin 2500 all the way up to 10,000 Kelvin. 5,000 is kind of our middle starting point, okay? So 5,000 usually represents daylight or white light. Anything below 5,000 will be significantly bluer. Of course, the lower the number, the more blue it will be. And if we go above 5,000, we're going to be adding red and adding warmth to that image. Right now, it's about 4 o'clock. I'm being lit by the beautiful blue sky here, and both of our video cameras are set to 5,000, which is a daylight balance. Imagine though if I was inside a dark home that was being lit by light bulbs, which as you know, burn very, very red. I would need to set the white balance a lot lower to get the exact same skin tones that you're seeing here. And that's all white balance is. You're basically counteracting the light that's hitting your subject. Now with my more expensive professional level DSLRs, I go in and manually change the Kelvin number. So I can change from 5,000 to 6,000 to 6,100, and I can go in and fine tune that. These DSLRs by both Canon and Nikon have really simplified the process for you. So instead of messing with a Kelvin temperature setting, you can actually set a scene. So if your subject is standing in bright sunlight, you choose the sun. If your subject happens to be standing in a cloudy area, you can choose the cloudy setting. Or if they're in shade, you can choose the shade setting. And basically the camera is going to give you the cue to choose the correct white balance without having to memorize every single custom Kelvin setting. So just to illustrate this point, I'm going to do a couple of portraits in a few different lighting scenarios. I'm going to show you how we can set the white balance manually to change the color of our pictures. So right now, David is standing in the exact same spot where I just was, and I'm going to hit the white balance button here on the camera, and I'm going to set it to daylight. And let's take a shot. So as you can see with this shot, I think we have a correct white balance here, but I might want to warm it up a little bit. I might want to add a little bit more red tone to this image. What's cool about the Canon camera in particular is that it actually tells you what the Kelvin setting is on each of these icons. So for the sun here, instead of 5,000, it's set to 5,200 Kelvin. If I move over to shade, that represents 7,000 Kelvin, 6,000 Kelvin for cloudy, 3,200 for tungsten light, which is like a normal light bulb, and then 4,000 Kelvin for a fluorescent light. Let's choose cloudy, which is 6,000. So we're adding 800 Kelvin. We're adding a little bit of red tone to the shot, and let's take the exact same shot again. I think this is much better. This may not be the correct white balance for this shot. I think it looks a lot more natural and a lot more inviting. So this is a great example of why you may want to manually control your white balance rather than allowing your camera to decide that for you. Now let's do something that I would not normally do. I'm going to move David out and put the sun directly in his face. It's not going to create the most beautiful looking image, but it will show us how the lighting can actually change with that shot. So now I've positioned David so that the sun is hitting him directly in the face, and as you can see, it's much warmer in this area. I'm going to take a shot with the exact same white balance as before, which was a cloudy setting, which represents 6,000 Kelvin. I'm imagining it's going to be a little bit too red. Just as I thought, it's a little bit too red. You can see that in the skin tones. It just doesn't look very natural. Let's cool it off a little bit. First, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the daylight setting, which Canon tells me here is 5,200 Kelvin. Let's give that a try. As you can see, this looks much better and much more realistic. When you're shooting in direct sunlight or with big open skies like this, your white balance is going to be right around 5,000 Kelvin, maybe 6,000, maybe 4,000, but somewhere right around in there. When you start shooting in shade though, things really start to cool off and your picture is going to look a lot more blue. You're going to have to add a lot more red to get a correct looking image. Let's try that now. So now we've moved inside of a park, and instead of being lit by the sun or the sky above us, we're actually being lit through speckled light coming through all of these trees. We are in deep shade right now. And because of that, our image is much cooler than it would have been outside of this shade. We've corrected the white balance with the video camera, so the way you're seeing me right now probably looks correct, but we're going to have to make those settings ourselves with the camera here also. For this first shot, I'm going to shoot it on sunlight or direct sunlight white balance, 5,200 Kelvin in this case, and let's see what it looks like. It really doesn't look so bad. You might not notice how blue the tones are in this image until we set the white balance correctly. So what I'm going to do is go into white balance here, and I'm going to set it to shade. Shade on this camera is 7,000 Kelvin. So we're going from 5,200 Kelvin all the way up to 7,000 Kelvin. We should see a lot more warmth in this next shot. This picture looks so much better. And this is such a good example of when white balance can completely transform the way an image looks. Now, if you weren't even considering white balance or you had your camera set to auto white balance, you may look at that first shot and say, this looks correct. Nothing about this looks wrong. It is a correct white balance. But then when you compare it to the second shot that was shot with the correct white balance and you can feel that warmth in the image, it's this subconscious thing that's happening with the picture that just makes it feel more professional and makes it feel like it was shot correctly. And I think that it's so much better. This is why it's so important that you are in control of your white balance and not the camera. Now, throughout these examples, I've been saying correct white balance. And the truth is, there may not actually be a correct white balance. In reality, whatever looks best to you is the correct white balance. When it comes to choosing the correct white balance for your shot, there's a few things that you need to consider. First of all, one, what exactly are you shooting? If you're shooting a person, you don't want their skin tones to be ultra red or ultra blue. We know the way humans are supposed to look, and you have a little bit of play there. You can make it a little warmer than it should be or a little bit cooler than it should be, but you can't go too crazy with it. Also, if you're shooting something that you know is supposed to be white, for instance, if you're shooting a bride in a white gown, you don't want her gown to go red. You don't want it to look yellow, or you don't want it to look blue. You want it to look correct. So there's a little bit of play that you can do there to add a little bit of warmth to your images to make them feel a little bit more inviting without going too far. But it really depends on what you're photographing and what your subject is as to how far you can actually push it. And so in this next example, I'm going to be shooting a sunset, and I'm going to be pushing the white balances to levels that I would never do with a normal person, because when you're looking at that picture after the fact, you don't really know what that sunset looked like. We've all seen sunsets before with blue skies. We've seen sunsets with magenta or with very bright red and yellow. So as the photographer, as the artist, it's up to us to choose the white balance that we want to create that sunset and make it as exciting as we want it to be. So now we're here at the Battery here at Charleston, and there's a beautiful sunset happening right over here. And I'm going to be using the Sony point and shoot camera here to choose different white balance settings. The funny thing about this camera is that this point and shoot camera actually gives us far more white balance options than the DSLRs. I know a lot of people think that a larger camera means it's more professional and has more options, and that's certainly not the case, especially today, and especially with this camera. Instead of just choosing a daylight setting or a shade setting, this camera actually allows me to cycle through all of the Kelvin range from 2500K all the way up to 10,000K, just like my professional level cameras do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the white balance first to 2500 Kelvin. Remember, that's very, very cool. It should be very, very blue. And what's also cool about this camera is I can actually see what the white balance looks like before I even select it. And wow, it is very, very blue. It feels much more like morning, like a sunrise before the sun has come up type image, even though it's sunset and I can tell with my own eyes it's very red. I can make it look very blue, which is cool. So let's go ahead and take this shot. So now I'm just going to bump up my Kelvin temperature 1,000 degrees with each shot. I'm gonna go from 2,500 to 3,500. As you can see, as I'm getting warmer and warmer with the Kelvin temperature, the images are getting much more warm. We reach a neutral point here where we can still see some blue in the sky, but we're also seeing the sun. I would consider this to be a correct white balance setting. If we continue to go though, and we make it more and more red, we can make it a little bit more dramatic. And it's up to you as the photographer to figure out which shot you like best. So at this point, the sun has dropped below the horizon and it is much more blue out here. In fact, our video cameras that are recording me right now, we have them set to 10,000 Kelvin. That's as warm as it will possibly go. And as you can see, I don't look that warm. So as you begin to shoot more often, when you get to situations like this, you will just become accustomed to setting white balance based on your subject and what you're shooting and what time of day you're shooting in, and of course, where you are located, shooting in direct sunlight versus shade. Now, we just shot this sunset and I shot through the entire Kelvin range with white balance, and you can see any of these shots could have worked because you don't really know what correct white balance is. You don't know if it was early in the morning and that water and sky should be crystal clear blue, or you don't know if that's sunset and it should be really, really red. So it's up to you to decide what you want your white balance to be and what you want the finished image to look like. So white balance is basically one simple technique that you can use to change the mood and the color of your images. Later in this tutorial, I'm actually going to teach you how you can change your white balance after the fact in post-production on your computer. But for right now, I wanted to keep it pretty simple. Let's move on to the next lesson.